It wasn't the first time Tony McGill had spoken about it, but this time, something felt different. The way he addressed the undeniable chemistry between Caitríona Balfe and Sam Heughan didn't sound like a passing comment or a polite acknowledgement anymore. It sounded measured, intentional, and strangely revealing. Fans who had followed their story for years immediately sensed the shift, as if a line that had always been carefully protected was suddenly being approached from a new angle. And the question that spread just as quickly as his words was simple: why now, and why again? For nearly a decade, the connection between Caitríona and Sam has been one of the most talked about dynamics in television. Their performances in Outlander didn't just convince audiences, they immersed them in a relationship that felt deeply authentic, almost too real to be confined to a script. Every glance, every touch, every emotionally charged scene carried a weight that made viewers believe there had to be something more beneath the surface. And over time, that belief grew into a narrative of its own, one that existed far beyond the boundaries of the show. But as that narrative intensified, so did the pressure surrounding it. The stronger their on-screen bond appeared, the more people began to question where acting ended and reality began. Interviews, public appearances, and even the smallest interactions between them were dissected and analyzed, often leading to conclusions that neither of them had explicitly confirmed. And in the middle of that growing storm of speculation stood someone who rarely spoke at all: Tony McGill. Unlike the constant visibility surrounding Caitríona and Sam, Tony maintained a life largely out of the spotlight. He wasn't part of the promotional circuits, he didn't engage with the same level of public scrutiny, and he rarely addressed the narratives that fans built around his wife. That silence, however, didn't mean detachment, it simply meant he chose his moments carefully. And when he did speak, even briefly, people listened in a way that made every word carry more weight than expected. In the past, his comments about Caitríona's work and her partnership with Sam were calm, supportive, and firmly grounded in professionalism. He acknowledged the demands of acting, the necessity of chemistry, and the reality that their connection on screen was part of what made the show successful. There was no visible tension, no hint of discomfort, at least not on the surface. But this time, something about his tone suggested a deeper awareness, as if he was no longer just describing the situation, but quietly responding to it. Those who heard his recent remarks noticed the subtle difference immediately. He didn't deny the chemistry, in fact, he seemed to recognize it more openly than before. But alongside that acknowledgement came a sense of boundary, an unspoken line drawn between what belongs to performance and what belongs to real life. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't defensive, but it carried a clarity that hadn't been there in earlier statements. And that's what caught fans off guard. Because instead of dismissing the speculation entirely, his words seemed to exist in a space between acceptance and distance. He wasn't rejecting the connection people saw, he was redefining how it should be understood. And in doing so, he unintentionally added another layer to a story that was already filled with unanswered questions. What made this moment even more intriguing was the timing. After years of consistent dynamics and carefully maintained public images, why revisit the topic now? Why emphasize something that had already been addressed before, especially when doing so could reignite the very speculation he had previously avoided? To many, it felt less like a random comment and more like a response to something building beneath the surface. Fans began to look back, re-examining past interviews, interactions, and moments that once seemed harmless. Small details started to take on new meaning, expressions, pauses, even the way conversations between Caitríona and Sam unfolded in public settings. It wasn't that anything had clearly changed, but rather that Tony's words had shifted the lens through which those moments were viewed. And that's where the tension truly began to grow. Because for the first time, it didn't feel like the conversation was being driven solely by fans or media speculation. It felt like someone from within the story had stepped forward, not to expose everything, but to subtly reshape the narrative. And when that happens, it changes how people interpret everything that came before. By the time the reactions started flooding in, the impact was already clear. What had once been seen as simple on-screen chemistry was now being questioned in a more complex, more uncomfortable way. Not because Tony McGill had revealed a dramatic secret, but because he had acknowledged just enough to make people wonder if there was more beneath the surface than anyone had been willing to admit. And for the first time, the idea that this might not be just acting didn't feel like pure speculation anymore. It felt like a possibility people could no longer ignore. The line between acting and reality has always been dangerously thin, but in this case, it suddenly felt almost invisible. What Tony McGill said didn't confirm anything outright, yet it changed the way people looked at everything that had come before. Because once someone that close to the situation acknowledges the chemistry, without dismissing it completely, it forces a new kind of question. Not whether it exists, but how far it actually goes. For years, Sam Heughan and Caitríona Balfe have worked side by side, building a connection that few on-screen partnerships ever achieve. Their understanding of each other goes beyond scripts and rehearsals, shaped by long hours, emotional scenes, and a shared responsibility to carry a story that millions are invested in. That kind of closeness doesn't just happen. It develops over time, layer by layer, until it becomes something instinctive. And when a connection reaches that level, it naturally starts to blur the boundaries people assume are firmly in place. That's where the discomfort begins, because chemistry like that can't always be easily defined. It's not necessarily romantic, but it's not entirely neutral either. It exists in a space where trust, familiarity, and emotional openness overlap, creating something that feels real even when it's part of a performance. And for those watching from the outside, that ambiguity becomes almost impossible to interpret without projecting their own assumptions onto it. Tony McGill's perspective adds a dimension that fans rarely consider. He isn't part of the performance, but he's close enough to understand the reality behind it. He sees the difference between what happens on screen and what exists off camera, but he also understands how easily those two worlds can begin to influence each other. And sometimes, understanding something doesn't make it less complicated, it makes it more. What makes his recent statement so powerful isn't just what he said, but what he chose not to say. There was no denial, no attempt to shut down the narrative completely, but also no suggestion that it had crossed into something inappropriate. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that chemistry exists, paired with an equally quiet insistence that boundaries matter. And that balance, between recognition and restraint, is what left so many people unsettled. Because it suggests that the truth isn't simple. It's not a hidden relationship waiting to be exposed, but it's also not an illusion that can be easily dismissed. It's something in between, something shaped by proximity, emotion, and years of shared experience. And that kind of connection, even when it stays within limits, can still feel intense enough to raise questions no one can fully answer. Fans, of course, reacted exactly as you would expect, split into opposing sides almost instantly. Some saw Tony's words as confirmation that everything had always been professional, that the chemistry people admired was simply the result of great acting and mutual respect. Others saw it differently, reading between the lines and interpreting his tone as a subtle admission that something deeper exists, even if it's never openly acknowledged. And that divide only fueled the conversation further. Discussions turned into debates, theories became more elaborate, and every new appearance by Sam and Caitríona was analyzed with renewed intensity. The smallest gestures, shared laughter, a brief look, a moment of silence, were suddenly loaded with meaning, as if they held clues to a truth no one could fully access. But perhaps the most revealing part of all this isn't the chemistry itself, it's how people respond to it. Because what audiences are really reacting to isn't just VV.